Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to welcome you today. Our topic is the geopolitical forces that will shape the spread of nuclear weapons. And our speaker is Mr. Eric Brewer from the Center for Strategic and International Studies. But before I introduce Eric, let me do a little bit more to introduce the topic. Three of the very first questions of the nuclear era back in 1944 and 45 were, would nuclear weapons spread from the one state that had acquired them to many? If so, how quickly? And what could be done to slow or halt such developments? And since then, the policy community interested in these questions has gone through waves of anxiety, followed by a relaxation. The first wave came with the wave of nuclear weaponization by first the Soviet Union, then the United Kingdom, France, and China. And by the 1960s, there were many countries that were beginning to put together nuclear weapons programs and forming nuclear ambitions. But that wave crested and broke with the agreement of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty in 1970. Anxiety began to rise again with the end of the Cold War, and the apparent nuclear ambitions of small regional challengers, also known as rogue states, who were resistant to the U.S.-dominated regional order in which they sit. And with this concern about rogue state proliferation was the associated concern over the falling dominoes effect that would come in the regions where they might acquire weapons. And this took its clearest form in Northeast Asia, where there was very strong concern about the choices that might follow in Tokyo and Seoul if Pyongyang were to proceed with nuclear weapons. But it would be fair to say that today, anxiety has somewhat tapered off again. Japan and South Korea did not follow nuclear weapons immediately with weapons programs of their own. That's not to say anxieties have gone away, and some new ones are taking shape. And to help, the failures of nonproliferation in the cases of North Korea and Iran have reinforced a different kind of anxiety about the health of the nuclear nonproliferation regime. This is in a high phase. This anxiety has gone up and up the last few years. So this brings us to a basic and simple question. Where are we headed? Toward a more proliferated world, incrementally so, or toward a breakdown of international nuclear order so that there is actually proliferation, which means the rapid spread of something? Or are we headed to a period of recovery and renewal for the nonproliferation regime? These questions were some of the motivating factors for the study that Eric Brewer and his colleagues at CSIS have recently brought to a conclusion. I'm very grateful to Eric for making the time to join us today to talk about this study. He is Deputy Director of the Project on Nuclear Issues at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a Senior Fellow there. He joined CSIS following a period as a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs Fellow at the Center for New American Security. That followed an important tour of duty at the White House. He served as Director for Counterproliferation on the staff of the National Security Council. In this capacity, he was responsible for coordinating U.S. policy to prevent and reverse the spread of nuclear weapons, their delivery systems, and related technologies. He moved to that NSC position from the staff of the National Intelligence Council. He served from 2014 to 2017 as Deputy National Intelligence Officer for Weapons of Mass Destruction and Proliferation. So you can see he brings a wealth of career experience from the policy side, the intel side, and the technical side to this topic. He has a bachelor's degree from the University of San Diego in international relations and a master's degree from George Washington University in international relations. So more expertise on the subject. Before turning it over to Eric, let me say that the ground rules are his remarks will be on the record until the Q&A portion, then we'll go off the record. And if you'd like to join the Q&A discussion, please send a chat message to either all panelists or to me. If you send it to the host, it will get misdirected off to the technical co-host, Katie Thomas. And if you'd like to join the conversation by posing your own question, please raise your hand electronically. Without further ado, Eric, let me turn it over to you. Thanks so much again for making the time to do this today.
Thanks, Brad. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a real pleasure to join you and everybody else who's coming in from Lawrence Livermore and other labs and across the U.S. government writ large. I'll do my best to try and answer some of those questions you laid out today. They're obviously really big ones, really important ones. I think you'll see over the course of this the presentation on these findings, I tend to fall into the slightly more worried category, but we'll sort of unpack, I think the successes that we've had on U.S. policy on nonproliferation, where we have some potential vulnerabilities and what we can do about it. So, Katie, if you wouldn't mind going ahead and projecting the slides, we can go ahead and get started. Perfect, thanks. So as Brad teed up, this report in a nutshell is really trying to take a stand back look at the geopolitical trends that are going to shape the future proliferation landscape and the U.S. ability to manage it. And we're really focused on a series of questions that try and help unpack that issue, and we'll talk about those in just a second. So let's go to the next slide. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about why this project, why this paper and this study. For a couple of reasons, we chose to pursue this type of a project in this scope. First, most studies, I think it's fair to say, have really focused on individual countries or particular regions when it comes to proliferation. And so we wanted to take a bit of a different tact here. There's also been a tendency to concentrate on technical aspects of the proliferation problem, vice the geopolitical angle. And so that's another gap we wanted to try and fill with this project. And third, we're at a time of profound geopolitical change. We'll talk about some of those changes throughout the course of the presentation. And there's been a lot of analysis on how these geopolitical shifts, be it great power competition, the change in U.S. role in the international order, how those are affecting things like arms control, but less on how those changes are impacting proliferation. And so this study is really an attempt to try and get at some of those issues and to answer some of those questions. And you'll see on the right, there's a couple of declassified, old NIEs or old Intel assessments. And to some degree, this report kind of takes inspiration from those types of approaches that really take that stand back look at broad proliferation trends and try and look at the proliferation forest, if you will, rather than individual proliferation trees. Next slide, please. So the key questions that this study seeks to answer, as I kind of alluded to a second ago, first, are the risks of nuclear proliferation increasing, decreasing, or staying the same? Second, why and in what ways? And third, perhaps most importantly, what can we do about it? And I should note right off the bat, and this is kind of gets to one of the questions that Brad asked, is when we're talking about proliferation here, we're not just talking about countries crossing the nuclear threshold and manufacturing a nuclear device and developing a nuclear arsenal. We're also talking about more broadly the spread of nuclear technologies, of latency, of hedging, and where we do specify it, talking about also the proliferation as relevant to potential nuclear delivery capabilities. Next slide, please. So the first question we want to talk about is kind of the good news side of this equation, right? What's working well when it comes to nonproliferation? And what we found is that over time, and this is, again, something that Brad alluded to at the outset, the U.S. international community have a pretty good track record at preventing proliferation, right? Over time, we've built what we know of today as kind of the nonproliferation or counterproliferation policy toolkit. That includes a whole range of tools that you all know very well, everything from multilateral treaties like the NPT, to other regimes that aim to restrict the supply of nuclear capabilities like the NSG, to U.S. extended deterrence and alliance relationships. And of course, there's a whole series of unilateral tools that the U.S. has at its disposal as well, everything from diplomatic pressure to sanctions to other types of covert measures. So it's a pretty robust toolkit that's been built up over time. And in the report, we talk about, as a result of those efforts, we can kind of make several what I would call safe bets today about the current environment and moving forward in the near term. The first one of those is that, and I should note this is kind of just a quick survey. There's other factors that we talk about in the report. The first is that the sale or transfer of enrichment and reprocessing technologies by governments to other states is unlikely. The second is that the IAEA, on balance, remains a pretty capable organization and really provides an important tool for following up on potential proliferation concerns. Third, it's hard to grasp and it's hard to define, but really there's a lot of important non-proliferation inertia in the international environment and within governments across the world, right? It has been embodied bureaucratically for a lot of countries, and those structures and those rules and those laws that have been built in over time don't just vanish, right? There's a strong amount of inertia there that is, I would argue, powerful and important. And third, I think we can expect economic statecraft, things like sanctions and other measures can continue to play an important role in the future, although later on we'll talk about some of the risks of overuse of those type of tactics. So one common thread that we see running through the development of this toolkit is that it was developed at a time when the United States was if not the dominant power, and that environment is changing. So next slide, please. So what's changing? Again, what we focus on in this study is really the geopolitical changes. We're no longer in the unipolar moment, so to speak. Challenges to U.S. influence and the rules-based international order are accelerating. But I would argue really the newer dynamic here is the U.S. is less inclined to advocate and perhaps defend the pillars of that international order. And I talk about a few here: alliances, international institutions, and free trade. And so that's kind of really the new development that's kind of prompted some of our examination of this topic. Another trend we see is an emergence of a more competitive security environment, particularly among major powers, and trying to define what, quote unquote, strategic competition looks like is beyond the scope of this study. But we do talk about, at a general level, I think it's fair to say that managing that competition is going to be an important feature of U.S. national security planning for the foreseeable future, and that the nature of that competition, although of course it will evolve over time, is probably going to be global in scope, occur across multiple domains, and really put a premium on, for the United States, on working with allies and partners. Next slide, please. And so really the important question, right, and this is kind of the answer and the bottom line to the effort is, what does this mean for proliferation? And again, on balance, I think there are more reasons to be concerned than there are to be optimistic. As the international system and the U.S. position within it evolve, the foundation on which those non-proliferation barriers rest, the ones that I just talked about a moment ago, are eroding and drivers of proliferation are increasing. And within this environment, 7 key trends are emerging that I'll talk about in a second. But in the report, we talk about kind of the collective effect or consequence of these trends. And there are 3 ways in which they're having an impact. The first is that they stand to increase pressures on countries to seek nuclear weapons or related capabilities as a hedge. Second, they stand to challenge the U.S. ability to effectively wield the traditional carrots and sticks of nonproliferation and counterproliferation policy. And third, they stand to potentially pit U.S. nonproliferation goals against other types of policy objectives, one of those being competition. Again, a point that I'll come back to towards the end of this briefing, forcing harder trade-offs between nonproliferation goals on the one hand and some of these other objectives. Next slide, please. So now I'll talk about the 7 trends throughout the remainder of this briefing. The first trend that we talk about in the report is that nuclear threats are increasing and regional security environments are becoming more tense, and that this is creating proliferation pressures. Research tells us that security threats, particularly nuclear threats, can be an important motivating factor for nuclear weapons ambitions and proliferation. And right now, when you look at Russia and China both expanding and modernizing both their nuclear and conventional capabilities. This is posing a range of challenges to U.S. deterrence and extended deterrence. You see both of those countries acting increasingly aggressive and using a range of means at a subconventional level to coerce, penalize, and destabilize U.S. allies, and trying to do the same for the United States itself in some ways. And so this is creating a lot of new dilemmas and security concerns. Of course, in North Korea, we are no longer in the world in which North Korea has a handful of nuclear weapons that may or may not be deliverable. We're in a world where it has a growing nuclear arsenal and a growing missile capability, including an ICBM capability, which again raises potential concerns for extended deterrence and assurance. And third, I would argue right now we see Iran expanding its capabilities. But even if we're, which is of course is concerning, but I think it's hard to foresee a future, regardless of whether it's the JCPOA or some other type of deal, where Iran doesn't retain a latent capacity to produce nuclear weapons. And so that's a factor that the United States and its allies are going to continue to have to contend with, and it's going to be something that drives concerns and nuclear decisions in Saudi and other countries. So the bottom line is that as these threats worsen, this provides motive for countries to proliferate and/or hedge. Next slide, please. The second trend we talk about, which is kind of the flip side of that coin, which is eroding ally trust and confidence in the United States, and that this increases the risk that U.S. allies and partners could seek nuclear weapons or weapons-relevant capabilities, right? And as many of you know, this is fear of abandonment has been a powerful motivator for allies to consider nuclear weapons or pursue them in the past. I have a list of countries there, but of course of several others. And I think it's important to talk about that these concerns are certainly exacerbated in many ways by the Trump administration and their approach to alliance management. But I think there's a deeper fear there of allies that this represents a broader shift in the U.S. political debate, and that just sort of portends a U.S. pullback from the international order. And that's deeply concerning to those allies. And so, we don't see any country, any ally or partner bolting the bomb just yet, of course, but what we do see is, I think, countries hedging their bets, right? We do see nuclear debates increasing in countries like South Korea, debates in Germany over potential alternatives to the U.S. extended deterrent, and countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey making public comments about the potential desirability of nuclear weapons. So, we're all very familiar with the comments of Mohammed bin Salman that, would threaten to produce nuclear weapons if Iran goes forward with that. And so I think, less likely is that any of these countries are going to break out, leave the NPT and produce weapons, but rather develop or advance hedging postures. And here I would also flag missile development as an important component of that. South Korea, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Japan, and others are investing heavily in new missile capabilities or space programs. And so even if not intended deliberately to potentially improve nuclear delivery capabilities, they nevertheless can enhance those potential pathways. And so, allied confidence in the United States is going to be a major factor we have to watch moving forward. Next slide, please. The third trend we talk about is the rise of autocratic governments. And the rise of authoritarian leaders in particular is increasing the chances of proliferation. And there's some good research out there that talks about the linkages between personalist dictatorships and those leaders being more likely to proliferate, face fewer domestic checks on a nuclear program, and be less constrained by international norms. And so to the degree that those types of leaders are on the rise and that there's going to be more of them, and you can see there on the slide, several examples of those types of leaders, and several of them are U.S. allies and partners, then we have to continue to be worried about proliferation because of those linkages. And we're going to have to continue to watch for developments in these types of countries. And again, as I alluded to a second ago, several of these countries and leaders have hinted at nuclear weapons ambitions or talked about the desirability of nuclear weapons. Turkey, Erdogan being another example, in addition to NBS, are investing in domestic nuclear programs. Brazil has talked about, expanding enrichment capabilities, potentially investing in nuclear-powered subs. And so, there's reason to keep an eye on these countries as they grow those nuclear capabilities, because it does provide a degree of latent capability. Next slide, please. The fourth trend we talk about is really, kind of the trajectory of arms control and the implications for the NPT. And as and if these prospects continue to dim for arms control measures that can reduce both US and Russian capabilities or otherwise cap growing global weapon stockpiles, then the bargain at that heart of the NPT likely is going to come under further strain, right? And that's going to continue to be a problem. We talk about how there's, we can talk about INF and other treaties that have that are now gone. There's risk to new start. But I would also argue that progress on other nonproliferation treaties, such as the CTBT and FMCT, is quite imperiled. And so, that matters for the vitality and the viability of the nonproliferation regime. And as this sort of unfolds, this could, complicate a lot of other U.S. objectives. U.S. NPT-related goals, such as strengthening Article 10, and also there's a risk that if and when the U.S. decides to deploy systems and capabilities that were banned under arms control agreements, such as INF range systems in Asia, that could have a side effect of making some nonproliferation goals harder, at least in the near term, such as denuclearization with North Korea. Next slide, please. The fifth trend we talk about is really, it's not a new trend per se, but it's certainly being driven home, I think, right now, and that is the declining ability of the United States to use civil nuclear energy sales and assistance to advance nonproliferation objectives. As you all know, the U.S. has long used for decades nuclear sales to bolster nonproliferation, right? Either by the stipulations and standard 123 agreements, the ability to go beyond that and get additional restrictions on enrichment and reprocessing, to convince countries to adopt the additional protocol, and of course, once those agreements are in place, leverage those connections to influence the direction of a country's program, including threatening to cut off that assistance, which was an important tool used to curb South Korean and Taiwan's nuclear weapons projects in the past. So as the ability to use those tools, as U.S. market share shrinks, and Russia and China are gaining ground in that regard, this is endangering the U.S. ability to write the nonproliferation rules of the road, right? And I think we see this playing out right now over the negotiations on the 123 with Saudi, where Saudi's kind of playing the different offers and the different parties off one another in order to secure a more beneficial deal, right? And so the U.S. is put in this bind where it could potentially debate lowering standards to get that 123 and have some degree of leverage, or maintain those high nonproliferation requirements, but potentially cede ground to other competitors. And I think 123 agreements are increasingly going to take on this geopolitical type angle, and we can talk about more about that later on in the Q&A session if folks want. Next slide, please. So, this trend is really about the future effectiveness of sanctions. And we talk about how, sanctions and other economic measures are really one of the most popular tools right now for policymakers, both at a tactical and a strategic level, right? At a tactical level, you can have more of a counterproliferation focus. You can cut off monetary transfers to impact countries' ability to acquire nuclear or other delivery related capabilities. You can try and slow the growth of programs, but also they're used at a strategic level to try and put sufficient pressure on countries to change their behavior, right, to come to the negotiating table. But I think looking forward, there are reasons to be worried about the U.S. effectiveness to do this in the future. A lot of this power comes from the U.S. dominance of the financial system and the fact that almost any financial transaction will touch the United States in some way, shape, or form, given a tremendous amount of leverage. But as things change, as that financial dominance erodes over the long term, and I want to be clear, I think this is a long-term trend. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. That sanctions are going to be harder to use, and that they're going to come with greater costs and risks as countries develop the ability to respond and retaliate. we're seeing this right now as countries take steps to insulate themselves from U.S. economic warfare. Right, countries are kind of learning what it means to be on the sort of the wrong side of U.S. policy in this regard. And I think the most salient example we see right now is Europe's recognition over the U.S. withdrawal of the JCPOA, withdrawal from the JCPOA, and the imposition of sanctions. Right, and so there's some more serious thinking going on about what steps they might take to detether themselves in some ways from the U.S. financial system. Countries are also becoming really adept at developing workarounds. Right, these are not kind of the cover companies and false end user certificates, and of course tactics that countries will still use. But North Korea is using some pretty sophisticated mechanisms like skimming off the top of credit card transactions to really put a huge dent in the U.S. efforts to cut off their ability to acquire hard currency. And so I think other countries are probably taking note of that. And so we're going to find it increasingly challenging in the future to use those types of mechanisms. That sort of cat and mouse game is going to get a lot harder. And then, of course, we see U.S. economic clout diminishing in some ways, and alternatives to the dollar slowly growing through both, alternative payment mechanisms of cryptocurrencies and dwindling U.S. dollar trade vis-a-vis Russia and China. So again, these are long-term factors, but they are, you can kind of see the direction that these winds are blowing, and they are, from the standpoint of effectiveness of sanctions, a little alarming. And the final point that we talk about here in the report is that, the U.S. is quite good at targeting rogue states, right? That's kind of, and Brad talked about this at the outset, that's kind of the bread and butter, right? Iran, Syria, North Korea, and previously Iraq. But to the degree that partners are a proliferation concern in the future, and as China's own clout grows and influence grows and willingness to use its own financial power and other means grow, sanctions are not going to be a cost-free tool for the United States anymore. And other countries are going to have more sophisticated means to respond to the U.S. sanctions, right? It is more of a double-edged sword when the U.S. employs these measures against other countries. For example, linkages with allies provide the U.S. with leverage. They also enable that ally to take a step that could potentially be more damaging to the United States than North Korea just test firing another missile, right? I think an example of this that we saw, I believe it was in 2018, where when the U.S. went to impose sanctions against some pretty senior officials within Turkey, Erdogan threatened to close Incirlik, right? And we can have a debate over, how serious that threat was. Would they actually do it? Would they be able to do it? But I think that points to the types of measures that allies could potentially use in the future if indeed they were motivated enough to do them. And so, the bottom line here is that sanctions are going to become increasingly complicated as a policy tool. Next slide, please. And the final trend that we look at is really the effect that great power competition is going to have on nonproliferation. And this is one of those issues, nonproliferation cooperation, that when you look at the studies being done and what's being written about where will competition intensify between the United States and Russia and China, nonproliferation is often talked about as one of these things that we can sort of hive off and protect and maintain, a degree of cooperation there. I'm not so sure that's the case, and I think we're starting to see some of that mistrust and some of that competition trickle into the nonproliferation arena in a few ways. And so I think, we're going to really struggle to protect those types of relationships and then protect the ability to cooperate on the nonproliferation front. And, a lot of this has to do with, I think, growing Chinese influence, right? China is going to get a bigger vote in the future on nonproliferation crises and different nonproliferation threats and scenarios. And so it is unclear, it is at least a big question, whether or not U.S. and Chinese interests will align on those questions. We know where China sits on Iran. We know where it sits on North Korea. We know a lot less about what China would feel about a Saudi proliferation risk, for example. And so I think that's something we've got to think about. And the final point that we talk about on this trend, and this is something I alluded to at the outset of the briefing, is that we could potentially find ourselves in a situation where U.S. nonproliferation goals are once again taking a back seat to other objectives. And in this case, we mean strategic competition. And right, and this sounds, strange to people who I talked to about this, who focus on nonproliferation as their bread and butter, because we're used to it being this very, very important policy issue and something that always ranks right at the top. As we know, historically, there's been instances where that hasn't been true. Israel and Pakistan and other cases where there's been those types of policy tensions. And so I think it is very conceivable that we could see scenarios where those similar tensions are playing out over cases of proliferation concern. And that could be, we talk about two possible ways that could happen in the report. The first is where the U.S. decides to take a lighter touch or back down on trying to pressure an ally or partner over proliferation concerns to avoid tensions, to avoid disrupting that relationship, and to preserve unity against a shared adversary or challenge. I would argue right now we see the U.S. taking that approach in the way it handles the Saudi proliferation challenge at this moment. I think that's a good analogy there. The second way it could potentially happen is where, because of a U.S. focus on burden sharing or wanting to enhance allied capabilities, this could encourage that ally or partner to either allow the acquisition of nuclear or missile relevant capabilities, or to encourage them to undertake those capabilities, right? And I think you see this playing out in some ways now on the lessening of missile restrictions and space restrictions on South Korea, on this question of South Korea once again taking interest in developing a nuclear-powered sub. Potentially, we've seen that ebb and flow over time, which potentially would allow them to push harder on the uranium enrichment door. So all of this to say, I think we shouldn't have rose-colored glasses when it comes to the question of how, or the issue of whether or not we can compartmentalize nonproliferation in this new environment of competition. Next slide, please. And so I think I've got just a couple more minutes here before I'm supposed to wrap up. But the final question of the study is, what can the U.S. do about this? And this is just a sort of a sampling of some of the recommendations we talk about in the report. But we'll kind of start from the broad observation that these geopolitical trends we talk about, really kind of the competitive environment and challenges to U.S. influence, they're really hard to change. So we should try and work within the confines of those trends and sort of recognize that reality. So one of the recommendations we make in line with that is that the U.S. should really think about how to construct nuclear deals with Iran and North Korea in ways that limit the risks of follow-on proliferation. And in the Iran case, this is thinking about how you can incorporate some of those elements of the JCPOA into and potentially building on it in ways that apply to other regional actors in the Middle East. And we can talk about details of these during the Q&A if folks are interested. In North Korea, I think, if the United States does decide to pursue more of an arms control approach with North Korea, it's really thinking about where the goal of denuclearization fits within that construct. Because I would argue the answer to that is important, and how we communicate that answer is important to shaping the potential motivations of other actors in the region to potentially feed their nuclear ambitions. Another thing we talk about is it's going to be really important to repair the trust deficit with allies. I think, speaking frankly, I think the current administration would really struggle in executing this, so it would probably be left to a future administration, and to work to adapt U.S. alliances to be more resilient in what is likely going to be an environment of further geopolitical stressors and disruptions, and how to think about how to update concepts of assurance to apply some of these allied security concerns. Third, we should really take a hard look at the sources of U.S. leverage for future proliferation challenges. And here again, I'll harp on that too, which is allied and partner proliferation, and also China, right? And this gets to the question of looking at, rather than coming into the NSC meeting where every department, every agency sort of presents its own toolkit as the option, really kind of doing more of a baseline review about the sources of U.S. leverage in some of these proliferation challenges, how it can apply them, what a country might do in response, how prepared the U.S. is for those types of scenarios, and game that out and plan it, so that we're not left in a situation where we think all of these tools that we have would work, and we walk in and we find out that actually, no, it's quite politically problematic to use some of these factors. So I think we've got to think hard about the sources of leverage and how we can use them and insulate ourselves from responses. And the final thing we talk about is potentially, this is a recommendation for Congress to update legislation that allows for additional penalties against proliferators, and not just the denial of certain types of benefits. And also to focus on where we may have countries of proliferation concern, reporting requirements and certification that require periodic updates from the appropriate government office, be it state, be it the intel community, about those countries' programs, and certifications that those countries are not pursuing sensitive activities such as enrichment and processing. Again, that's just kind of a sampling of the recommendations. There are, of course, more in the report, and happy to talk about any of these further during our discussion today. And so that concludes my remarks, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Eric. That was excellent overview. Thank you. Very interesting work.